3 Navy SEALs are trapped in a collapsing building in Mosul. A sniper is watching every approach. 2 soldiers already tried to reach them. 2 soldiers are down. Nobody knows where the shooter is. No drone, no sniper team, no technology. Just one cavalry scout with 4 notebooks full of dust patterns, bird movements, and morning shadows she's been tracking for 4 days. Her commanding officer calls it guessing. She calls it reading sign. Her grandfather taught her in a Michigan forest when she was 7 years old. She's about to use it on a medieval stone city in Iraq. The sniper is somewhere in 3 buildings. She has 20 minutes to figure out which one. Sergeant Tara Holt read the street the way her grandfather had taught her to read the forest. Not looking for the thing itself, looking for what the thing had done to the world around it. She was 23 years old, 3 years in the army, 8 months in Mosul, and she had learned something about cities that nobody had put in a field manual. A city was a forest. Different materials, different geometry, different species of threat, but the same fundamental principle. Everything that passed through a space left something behind. Everything that occupied a position changed the environment around it. Every action produced a record. The record was readable if you knew how to read it. Her grandfather's name was Joseph Makwa. He was born on the Lansing Indian Reservation on the Keweenaw Bay in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan in 1944, the second of 6 children. He hunted the forests of the Upper Peninsula his entire adult life, not as recreation, but as provision, in the tradition of the Ojibwe people who had lived in that specific intersection of forest and lake for thousands of years, and who had developed, over those thousands of years, a comprehensive system of environmental knowledge that no outsider training manual could approximate. He was a quiet man, not shy. Quiet in the specific way of someone who learned that most of the important information in the world was not transmitted through speech. He worked as a mechanic at the reservation's community shop during the week, and hunted on weekends from October through December. And in the summers he fished the lake, and he taught Tara to do both beginning when she was 6 years old. The summer her mother brought her north for the first extended visit. The grandfather looked at the granddaughter for a long time and said in his direct way, "I have things to teach you." She said yes. She was 6. She did not fully understand yet what yes meant in that context. She understood it now. The first thing he taught her was to stop moving. This was the foundational skill, the one that everything else rested on, and it was the hardest to learn because it ran counter to the impulse that most people had in unfamiliar environments, which was to keep moving until something resolved. He took her into the forest east of the reservation on a September morning when she was 7 years old, found a place where a deer trail ran through a stand of second-growth birch and maple, and told her to sit down and be still. She sat. She was still. After 20 minutes, she started to fidget, and he said, "Not yet." She was still. After 40 minutes, she said she was bored, and he said nothing. After an hour, a doe walked through the birch stand 20 meters from where they sat, unhurried, completely unaware of them, moving with the confidence of an animal that had detected nothing wrong in its environment. Her grandfather said quietly, after the doe passed, "What did you?" She said, "A deer." He said, "What else?" She thought about it. She said, "I saw how she moved. She wasn't scared. She was just walking." He said, "Yes. She wasn't scared because we didn't scare her. She walked her trail because the trail was still the trail." He paused. "Do you understand what that tells you?" She said, "It tells me she was here before we sat down, and we didn't change the trail." He nodded. He said, "The environment remembers. Everything that moves through it leaves something. If you learn to read what is left, you know what has moved through." She thought about this for a long time. When she was 12, she misread a deer trail and led them in the wrong direction for 2 hours before he stopped and showed her, quietly, where she had gone wrong. She said, "I should have been right. I did everything you taught me." He said, "What did you not do?" She thought about it. She said, I didn't go back to the baseline. I started with a conclusion and read the sign to confirm it instead of reading the sign to find the conclusion." He nodded. He said, "That's the failure every time. Not the sign, not the reading. The order. You read the sign first, you draw the conclusion after. Never the other way around." She spent 9 years practicing this. There was a second lesson when she was 14. He took her to a section of the forest where a logging operation had cleared several acres 3 years before. The second-growth birch and aspen had come in dense and uniform, and the deer had shifted their patterns to accommodate the change in cover. The old trails were still visible but no longer primary. New trails had formed. She tried to read the new trails and got confused. He watched her work for 20 minutes. Then he said, "Stop. What did the forest look like 3 years ago?" She said, "More cover, bigger trees. The trails would have been different." He said, "Yes, the trails you're reading now were made by animals responding to a change. They don't make sense by themselves. They only make sense in relation to what they're responding to." He looked at her. When you don't understand the sign, ask, "What changed?" The sign is always a response to something. Find the something and the sign becomes readable. What changed? She applied this in Mosul from the first week. Every morning, before beginning the day's observations, she asked, "What changed since yesterday? What is the environment responding to that it was not responding to before?" The answers were almost always small. A door that had been open was now closed. A stretch of wall that had been dusty yesterday was scuffed today. A cooking fire had moved. Small changes. Responses to pressure. The environment always told you what had been applied to it. The specific thing she had to learn in the city that the forest had not fully prepared her for was the density of information. In the forest, a trail through the Upper Peninsula's second-growth timber had maybe a dozen relevant data points per 100 meters. A city had thousands. Every footprint in every alley, every scratch on every wall, every burn mark from cooking fires, every piece of trash that had been moved and not moved again. All of it was data. All of it was sign. She had to learn, in the first weeks of the deployment, to do what her grandfather had taught her about the logging-cleared section of forest. Find the baseline first, identify the change, then read what the change was responding to. Most of the city's signs were irrelevant to her specific mission. Most of the deer's signs in the forest were also irrelevant on any given day. The skill was not in reading everything. It was in reading quickly enough to identify the specific deviations that mattered. By the time she was 15, she could estimate how long ago a trail had been made from the quality of compressed grass and the weather that had acted on it. By the time she was 17, the year her grandfather died of pancreatic cancer in the hospital in Baraga, she could enter a forest and within 15 minutes build a working model of what had moved through it in the previous 24 hours: deer, coyote, raccoon, human, direction, approximate time, probable purpose. In Mosul, by the end of her 3rd month, she could enter a block and within 20 minutes develop a working model of the human activity that had occurred in it in the previous 12 hours. This was not magic. This was baseline plus deviation plus interpretation. It was what her grandfather had spent 11 years teaching her, in a language that the army did not have a name for. The specific knowledge he gave her was not mystical. It was empirical. It was built from principles, and the principles were consistent and transferable. Everything that moved through an environment disturbed that environment in specific and predictable ways. The disturbance was proportional to the size of the thing that moved, the speed at which it moved, the time that had passed since it moved, and the specific qualities of the environment it moved through. If you understood these relationships, you could work backward from the disturbance to the thing. If you had been watching the environment long enough to know what the undisturbed baseline looked like, you could detect disturbances that would be invisible to someone who had not been watching. This was tracking, not intuition, not mysticism, applied environmental analysis. She thought about this on her first day in Mosul, standing in an alley in the Western District, looking at the compressed stone and mortar walls and the dust that lay over everything and the specific patterns of foot traffic in that dust. She thought, same principles, different medium. She had started the notebooks that day. She joined the army at 18, 8 months after the funeral, partly because of grief, which she did not examine directly, but which was present as a weight that required focused action to carry. Partly because the skills her grandfather had given her felt, in some deeply intuitive way, military in application, even though they had come from the forest. The translation had not been immediate. In the first month of her deployment, she had walked through Mosul's streets, trying to apply forest logic to stone and mortar, and had found the surface-level differences overwhelming. No green, no soil, no running water, no seasons to interpret. Everything was dust and concrete, and the specific gray pallor of a city that had been under siege. Then she had stopped trying to see the city as a different forest, and had started seeing it as the same problem in different materials. The deer trail through fresh snow was the dust in a Mosul alley. The bent grass was the scuffed stone on a doorstep. The still water where the deer had stopped was a window left open in a building where all the other windows were closed. The birds displaced from a rooftop were the same as the birds displaced from a forest's canopy, always reading the environment around them and responding to what they found in it. She had started the notebooks that day. She requested the infantry branch. They told her she was not eligible at the time of her enlistment. She requested cavalry scout. They said yes. She was a 19D cavalry scout. Her official function was reconnaissance, surveillance, and security in support of the main effort. Her immediate section chief, Staff Sergeant Derek Moss, described her function more specifically as observe and report without being an idiot about it. This was, she had come to understand, Moss's highest expression of professional respect. He gave it to her maybe once a week. Moss was 32 years old, from El Paso, Texas, 12 years in the Army, 3 previous deployments. He was not a bad leader. He was methodical. He was fair. He enforced standards consistently and took care of his people in the ways that mattered. He made sure they slept when they could. He pushed back on assignments that exceeded the section's capability. He was honest about what was happening and what was coming. His blind spot was specific. He trusted systems and processes and established doctrine. And Tara's approach to observation did not correspond to any system or process or doctrine he was familiar with. It looked from the outside like intuition. He did not trust intuition in a tactical environment. Intuition, in his experience, got people killed. He was not wrong about intuition. He was wrong about what she was doing. It was June 2017. The Battle of Mosul was in its final phase. The Iraqi security forces, backed by U.S. advisors and special operations elements, were clearing the last districts of the Old City from the remnants of ISIS. The Old City was a medieval warren of narrow streets and dense stone construction. Alleys barely wide enough for 2 people to walk abreast, buildings stacked against each other like the pages of a compressed book. From a tactical standpoint, the worst possible urban environment. No sight lines, no clear fields of fire, no logical geometry, and a civilian population that had been living under ISIS for 3 years. The scout section's observation post was on the third floor of a partially damaged building overlooking a key intersection. From the OP, they could see approximately 180 meters of open ground in one direction, and perhaps 60 meters in the other before the streets turned and the sightlines disappeared into the compressed geometry of the old quarter. She had been in this OP for 4 days. She had 4 notebooks full of observations, not the standard observation log the section was required to keep, which tracked vehicle movements and personnel activity in standard format. Her own parallel notebook, which tracked environmental indicators, the way dust settled overnight in the intersection, which movement patterns disturbed it, where birds were and were not, the way light moved through gaps in destroyed buildings as the sun tracked across the sky, the patterns of cooking fire smoke that told you where civilians were sheltering and in what numbers. Moss saw the notebooks once. He said, "That's not observation, that's guessing." She did not correct him. She thought about whether the correction would produce useful change or only friction. The notebook was already in her desk. The analysis was already happening. The only thing a confrontation would change was the quality of her working relationship with Moss. She decided the notebooks were more important than the argument. The disputes came in 3 distinct rounds. The first came 3 weeks into the deployment. She spent 2 hours mapping civilian approach patterns in a specific market area and produced a sketch identifying movement windows with lower civilian density. She brought it to Moss. He looked at it for 30 seconds. "You can't predict how civilians will move in a market. That's not how this works." "I'm not predicting," she said. "I'm analyzing historical patterns. It's not the same thing." He looked at her with the patience of someone being very careful not to say something he would regret. In this environment, analysis and prediction are the same mistake. If we act on your analysis and it's wrong, someone gets hurt. If we act on confirmed intelligence and it's wrong, at least we know where we failed. Every confirmed intelligence product began as unconfirmed analysis. That's above my pay grade. He meant it literally, not as a dismissal. When the methodologists in the intelligence community certify your approach, I'll use it. Until then, stick to reportable observations. She filed the sketch in her notebook. She continued doing the analysis. The second dispute came a month later. She brought a 4-element assessment to Moss, identifying a specific building as a probable ISIS observation post, and recommended requesting a follow-on element to clear it. She had taken the time to write up the 4 elements in the section's standard reporting format, annotating each element with its observational basis and its relationship to the others. He read it. He took more time with it than she expected. She watched him go through each element, and she could see him working through the logic, following the chain from evidence to interpretation. He was a methodical man. The logic was not inaccessible to him. He put it down. He shook his head. Probable is not reportable. Confirmed is reportable. Confirmed takes more time than we have if they move before we clear it. Then we report what we can confirm and request ISR to develop the target. He paused. That's the process, Holt. The process exists so people don't get killed because one analyst decided they were confident enough to skip the confirmation step. She thought about what he said. He was describing a real failure mode. He was correct that the failure mode existed. He was wrong that it applied to her methodology, because her methodology was not an analyst deciding they were confident enough. It was a structured analysis of 4 independent indicators that converged on a single location. The difference was the same difference between guessing at an answer and showing your work. The outcome of both might be the same correct answer, but only one of them was reproducible and auditable. The only way to demonstrate this was to be right. She went back to her notebooks. 2 days later, the building was confirmed as an ISIS observation post when a subsequent unit moved through and found it occupied. Moss said nothing to her about this. The third time came 6 weeks ago, when she asked whether she could implement a broader environmental baseline analysis for the section's entire area of operations. "We observe and report what's in front of us," Moss said. "We don't run research projects." "Yes, Sergeant." She went back to her notebooks. She had not stopped analyzing. She had just stopped presenting it as analysis. She was good at her job. She was going to do her job. The morning of the day everything happened, she had been in the OP since Oro 400. The night had been quiet in the specific way of nights in the old city that followed significant daytime activity. A quiet that was earned, not given, with a different quality from the quiet of a genuinely inactive area. The environment had been disturbed during the previous day's fighting and was still settling back to baseline. She noted in her environmental notebook, post-activity stillness, transition pending. She noted other things. The cooking fire in the building 3 blocks south had not been lit this morning. Over the 4 days, it had been lit at Aro 500 local, every morning, by civilians sheltering in the basement who prepared food in the early dark before the active fighting hours began. This morning, no fire, no smoke. The civilians had either moved or were not cooking. Either interpretation was significant. People who were sheltering in place and felt secure continued their routines. A change in the routine meant a change in the environment. She noted the specific quality of the dust in the intersection below the OP. 4 days of the same foot traffic patterns. The specific way that the dust was disturbed in the morning by whatever movement had occurred overnight, then disturbed further as the day's activity began. She had been watching this long enough to know the overnight baseline. This morning, the dust in the southwest corner of the intersection, disturbance patterns that were larger and more recent than standard overnight movement. Something heavier than a cat or a dog had moved through the southwest corner in the last 3 or 4 hours. She noted all of this. She did not know yet what it meant. The baseline was the point. You built the baseline so that when something mattered, you had the comparison. She did not know what the transition was going to be. She knew there was going to be one. At a 717, a Task Force Archer element, a 4-person SEAL team operating in advance of the main Iraqi security forces line, entered the grid square 3 blocks northeast of the OP. She tracked them through her scope, 4 figures in the distinctive configuration of the task force, moving by bounds along the eastern wall of a narrow street, pursuing a specific objective. At 0734, the building they entered exploded. Not dramatically, not like a car bomb or artillery, a contained structural explosion, probably a command-detonated IED emplaced in the building's interior, designed not to destroy the structure but to collapse a specific section. The blast was loud but bounded. The building's exterior walls on 2 sides remained mostly intact. The interior floors of approximately the rear 2/3 dropped, taking the roof with them. She tracked the blast. She watched the dust cloud expand and settle, and watched the front section of the building, still standing, and waited. 2 minutes after the blast, a figure appeared in a window of the building's front section, 1st floor. Hand signal. 3 fingers, then a fist, then 2 fingers, 3 people, trapped, 2 injured. She set it to the section channel, directing it at Moss. Archer element, 3 personnel, structure northeast grid, 2 wounded. Copy, I see them. Moss was on the radio immediately, relaying to the battalion operations center. 40 seconds later, from a direction she could not immediately identify, a shot. One of the ISLF soldiers moving toward the Archer building fell in the open ground between the 2 structures. He did not get up. He had been hit in the upper body. she noted. Single shot, no visible muzzle flash from her angle, the soldier fell backward and to his left. She thought about the body mechanics of the impact. Backward and to the left, from his direction of travel, which had been northeast. Backward relative to his line of advance, left relative to the direction he had been facing. This told her something about the angle of incidence. Not from directly ahead of him, not from his flank, but from a vector between those two. From the northeast, angled slightly south. She noted this in her notebook. 7 minutes later, a second shot. A second ISF soldier, different angle of approach, hit while attempting to reach the building from the south side. He went down. The fall told her, same direction of fire, consistent with the northeast slightly south vector. 2 shots. She had a directional sector. I have a direction of fire on the sniper, she told Moss. Northeast, approximately 30 degrees spread, elevation unknown. What's your basis? Impact analysis from the 2 casualties. That's not confirmation. He was on the radio again, relaying the sniper contact. She did not argue. She turned back to her scope and began the second element of the analysis. The sun was at approximately 0730 local, in the east-southeast at an elevation of roughly 28 degrees above the horizon. The shadows fell northwest, long, definite, predictable. She had been watching shadows in this area for 4 days and had a baseline for what they looked like. Her grandfather had taught her this at the beginning. You cannot know what is anomalous until you know what is normal. 4 days of shadow observation gave her a shadow map, which buildings threw shadow over which streets at which times, which windows were in direct light versus shade, which positions would expose a person to backlight and which would keep them in cover. She looked at the northeast sector. She thought about which buildings could have a firing position with physical line of sight to the Archer building's approaches. Not all buildings. The street geometry created dead zones. Areas blocked by intervening structures, regardless of where in a building you positioned yourself. An ISIS sniper with any tactical knowledge would have scouted for a position that provided clean sight line to the target area and cover from counterfire. Her grandfather would have said, "The deer does not bed in the open. It beds where it can see and where it cannot be seen." She began eliminating buildings. Building A, 3 stories, directly northeast. She had been observing this building for 4 days. In her baseline, pigeons roosted on the eastern parapet every morning between 0600 and 900, departing when the sun warmed the stone. This morning at 0730, the eastern parapet was empty. The pigeons had not come. This was not conclusive. There were many reasons pigeons might shift, but it was a data point. Something had changed in the environment of that parapet or in the adjacent structures within the last several hours. She noted it as a supporting indicator, not a primary one. The shadow geometry of Building A was also less optimal than she would have expected a sniper to choose. The sun at this hour would be directly in the face of anyone shooting from Building A's northeast corner toward the Archer building. Not impossible, not preferred. Building B, 2 stories with an irregular roofline, partially destroyed on the north end. The geometry of the street between Building B and the Archer building included a collapsed wall section that would partially block the sightline to the Archer building's main approach from most positions in Building B. Possible, but geometrically constrained. The time interval between shots was inconsistent with the geometry of Building B. A position in Building B could see the approach area clearly from most second-floor positions, which meant no repositioning time would be required, which did not match the 11 and 7-minute intervals she had observed. Building B was lower probability. Building C, 4 stories, partially destroyed on the upper floors. The lower floors were intact. She had been watching Building C all morning and observed nothing anomalous in the standard sense, no personnel movement, no visible equipment. But anomaly in environmental terms was not the same as anomaly in personnel terms. It was subtler. Building C's sun geometry was better for a northeast shooting position than Building A's. At 7:30, Building C's northeast corner would have the sun at roughly 35 degrees to the east, behind and to the right of a shooter looking southwest toward the Archer building. The light would not be in the shooter's face. The shadow from the collapsed upper floors would provide additional concealment from aerial observation. She focused her scope on Building C's second floor, northeast corner. In the shadow of the collapsed upper section, on the north face, she saw a specific pattern in the dust that coated the exterior stonework at the window level. Not the uniform accumulation of an unoccupied building that had been collecting Mosul's summer dust for 3 years undisturbed. A compressed, slightly disturbed pattern, as if the dust had been pushed against the window frame from the inside. The disturbance was the kind that built up over hours. Someone had been opening and closing that window, leaning against that frame, pressing against the stonework. Not once, multiple times. This morning, before she was looking, she noted this. It was consistent with an occupied firing position. It was also consistent with a civilian sheltering. Sign required interpretation. Then she thought about the time between the shots. 11 minutes between the first shot and the first ISF approach. 7 minutes between the second ISF approach attempt and the second shot. The intervals were not random. They were consistent with a position that had a limited sight line. The sniper could not see the full approach area, only a specific window of it, and had to wait until a target entered that window before he could engage. Her grandfather's voice. The track tells you where it was. The bent grass tells you where then the still water tells you where it stopped. The time between the track and the bent grass tells you how fast it was moving and why. The time between the shots. The sniper was not changing position. He was shifting within his firing position, reacquiring the target when it appeared in a gap between buildings. The shift took time. Not a lot of time, but time consistent with a narrow observation window that required repositioning rather than simple re-aiming. She thought about Building A and the missing pigeons. Pigeons on a rooftop established a baseline. A change in the baseline indicated a change in the environment. The eastern parapet of Building A was connected at the alley level to the north face of Building C. A person moving through Building C from an interior access point, a connecting basement or first floor access through the alley, would disturb the environment in a way that birds at the connected structure would potentially respond to. She thought, Building C second floor, northeast corner, a gap sight line to the Archer building's approaches, a limited observation window requiring repositioning between shots, access through alley or connecting basement, occupied in the last several hours. The 4 elements combined, impact angle from the 2 casualties pointed northeast with a southward deflection, consistent with a position in the northeast buildings. Shadow geometry eliminated Building A from the preferred position list based on unfavorable sun angle for the shooter and eliminated Building B based on the geometry of the collapsed wall section. Time intervals between shots were consistent with a narrow sight line requiring positional shift, which corresponded to Building C's window geometry, looking through the gap between Buildings D and E. Dust disturbance on Building C's northeast window frame was consistent with an occupied firing position of several hours' duration. The displaced pigeons from Building A's eastern parapet were consistent with human activity in Building C, to which Building A was adjacent at the alley level. 4 independent indicators, all 4 consistent with the same location, none of them individually sufficient. all of them together pointing at the same place on the map. She was not certain. She was reading sign. Sign was not certainty. Sign was probability, shaped by evidence, filtered through knowledge of the environment. Her grandfather had never told her that reading sign gave you certainty. He had told her that reading sign gave you the best available interpretation of what the evidence actually said, which was different from what you expected it to say or what you wanted it to say. She had a high probability position. Moss. She kept her voice flat. I have a probable position on the sniper. What's the basis? Impact angle from the two casualties. Shadow geometry from the sun position. Time intervals between shots. Dust disturbance on building C, second floor, northeast corner. Bird displacement from building A's eastern parapet. He was quiet for a moment. Holt. That's analysis from. I know what it's from. She said it without hostility. I know it's not confirmed tactical intelligence. The SEALs have maybe 3 hours before that structure fails. We can't get a drone. We can't get a sniper. She paused. I'm not asking to shoot. I'm asking to use the position I've identified to find the approach route the sniper can't see. What do you mean? If the sniper is in building C, northeast corner, second floor, with a limited sight line to the gap between buildings D and E, then there's a section of the Archer building's approach that is not in that sight line. The west face along the street from the south. If his observation window is northeast, the west approach is in his dead zone. Moss said nothing for 3 seconds. She pulled out the notebook, her notebook, not the official log. She had a sketch of the building layout, the sight lines she had mapped over 4 days, the dead zones she had identified in routine analysis without knowing they would matter this morning. She showed him the sketch. The sketch was detailed in a way the official log was not. She had drawn sight lines from the probable firing positions she identified on each of her 4 days in the OP, not just building C, but all of them, building by building. The dead zones emerged from the intersections of the sight lines, areas that fell below the observation threshold of every probable position simultaneously. Those dead zones were determined by building geometry, not by her assessment of any individual sniper's intentions. He looked at the sketch for a long time. He ran his finger along the route, south along the building wall opposite, staying in wall contact, approaching the Archer building's south face. How confident are you? I'm confident in the position. I'm confident in the sightline geometry. The dead zone on the west approach is based on building geometry, which is confirmed. She paused. If I'm wrong about the position, the dead zone is still there. Using the dead zone is correct regardless. Moss looked at the sketch again. He looked at the window of the building where the SEAL team was pinned. He looked at the time, 0814. He said, all right, walk me through it. She walked him through the route. South along the building wall, opposite the Archer building, moving in close contact with the wall, approaching the Archer building's south face from a vector that stayed inside the dead zone of Building C's northeast corner window for the entire approach. The dead zone was not a guess. It was a geometric fact derived from the building layout. If the sniper was in Building C's northeast corner at the second floor, his sight line to the Archer building's approach was governed by the buildings in between. The gap between buildings D and E was the only opening. Everything to the west of that gap, a corridor approximately 40 meters wide, running north-south along the Archer building's west face, was physically invisible from Building C's northeast corner. Not probably invisible, geometrically invisible. The buildings were in the way. She had known this for 3 days. She had mapped it as a dead zone in her routine analysis without knowing it would matter. She had noted it because the dead zones were as important as the sight lines. They were the spaces where movement was unobserved, and in Mosul in June 2017, Unobserved movement was survival. It was not a safe route. No route in the old city in June 2017 was safe, but it was the safest available route given the information she had. "If you're wrong about the building," Moss said, "then they could get shot from a position I haven't identified. There may be a second sniper I haven't accounted for." She held his gaze. "I can't read what I can't see. Everything I've observed over the last 4 days is consistent with one sniper in Building C, and both shots this morning are consistent with the position I've identified." Moss looked at the sketch one more time. "We go with your west approach. I need 2 people in overwatch on the north side while the extraction team moves." "I'll do overwatch on Building C," Tara said. "If he shifts, I'll see it." "You sure?" "The window where he's positioned has a specific orientation. When he shifts within it, the light changes in the gap between buildings D and E. I can see that from here." Moss nodded once. Not approval exactly. The specific movement of a man who had decided to commit to a course of action he was not fully comfortable with, and who was being honest about that discomfort without letting it stop the action. "Go," he said. The extraction was 4 people: Moss, the corporal, and 2 of the senior specialists. They moved the way soldiers moved in a sniper's environment when they had a plan and were executing it with discipline. Each movement deliberate, each position held long enough to confirm before advancing. The wall contact maintained at every step. She was in the OP, scope on the gap between buildings D and E, looking for the specific light change that would indicate the sniper repositioning. The gap was narrow, perhaps 2 meters of visible airspace between the building's facades, and the light through it was the particular bright white of a Mosul morning in June, slightly hazy, the dust always in the air catching the light and diffusing it. She was looking for a change in that light, a shadow interrupting it, a movement behind the gap. She breathed slowly. Her grandfather had taught her the same thing. The deer sees movement before it sees shape. You are more invisible when you are slow than when you are still. The extraction team moved south along the west wall, 40 meters, 60. The street was empty, no shot, 80 meters. The team rounded the corner to the south face of the Archer building. Still no shot. She watched the gap between buildings D and E. The light was steady. The sniper had not shifted. At 0827, the first SEAL emerged from the Archer building's south entrance. Mobile. Moving with assistance but mobile, one hand on the wall for support. Then the second, also mobile, one arm held across his chest at an awkward angle that told her the shoulder was damaged. Then a 6-minute gap. 6 minutes during which Fike kept the scope on the gap and watched the light and breathed, and did not allow herself to think about what 6 minutes meant structurally in a building that had already had its main floor section drop. The light in the gap was steady. Then the third SEAL carried on a 2-person carry by Moss and the corporal, unconscious or close to it, equipment still on. The weight visible in how both men's posture adapted to the load. They moved back along the south route, west wall, the same way they had come. She tracked them peripherally. She kept the gap in focus. The light was steady. She watched until Moss said, "Back in," and she knew they were inside the OP's perimeter. No shot. At 0839, they were back in the OP. Moss was on the radio for 3 minutes, relaying status, coordinating medical, doing the dozen administrative things that had to happen when an element with casualties came in. She watched the 3 SEALs through the OP's interior doorway. 2 sitting, equipment off, a medic working on the shoulder wound. The third still unconscious, laid on a stretcher, the corporal monitoring his breathing. All 3 alive, all 3 inside. When Moss was done with the radio, he turned to her. "The position you identified?" "Yes. I'm going to need a precise grid for it, for the follow-on sniper team." She gave him the grid. She had calculated it during the extraction. How did you build this? He said. What you showed me on the sketch. Environmental analysis, 4 elements, impact angle, shadow geometry, time interval, dust disturbance. They're not independent. Each one constrains the others. The position that satisfies all 4 is the most probable position. You've been doing this every day. Yes. In the notebooks. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. I told you that wasn't analysis, that it was guessing. She said nothing. I was wrong about that. She said nothing still. She was not going to say it was all right. It was not all right. It had been wrong for 6 months and 3 formal disputes, and the loss of a confirmed ISIS OP that had been in her notebook for 2 days before it was confirmed by other means. It had been wrong in ways that the Army's formal processes would not track and that her server's record would not reflect, because the record only captured what was submitted through proper channels, and what she had submitted through proper channels was the minimum she could submit while still doing the job she had come here to do. He was right to correct himself. That was worth something. I was wrong about the methodology, he said. I was not wrong about the confirmation requirement. He paused. Both things are true. I need you to understand that. I understand that, she said. The next time you have something at this level, you come to me earlier, before you have the full picture. You bring me the partial analysis, and we figure out how to get it to a confirmation standard. She looked at him. Yes, Sergeant. He said it simply, without decoration. I want you to write up the methodology, what you did today, the 4 elements, how you combined them, how you derived the dead zone. It's not in any field manual. It needs to be. She thought about her grandfather. She thought about the forest east of the reservation. The September morning when she was 7, the doe walking through the birch stand 20 meters from where they sat. She thought about what he had said. The environment remembers. Everything that moves through it leaves something. It's tracking methodology, she said. Applied to an urban environment, the principles are the same as wilderness tracking. The medium is different. What are the principles? Everything leaves sign. Sign is evidence of passage. Evidence of passage analyzes against the environmental baseline, produces probability assessments of what has moved through, in what direction, at what time, with what purpose. She paused. The accuracy of the assessment depends on the quality of the baseline. You can't read anomaly without knowing what normal looks like. 4 days in the notebooks. 4 days building the baseline. Write it up, all of it. The baseline methodology, the 4-element analysis, the dead zone derivation. I want it in the after-action report. Yes, Sergeant. The follow-on sniper team, using the grid she provided, confirmed the Building C position and neutralized it at 0914. She did not observe this directly. She was writing up the methodology in her notebook. The after-action report went up the chain. The senior officer who reviewed it initially wrote the attribution generically. Coordinated defilade approach based on tactical analysis. Moss flagged this and said, the approach route was derived from a specific analytical methodology developed and executed by Sergeant Holt. The record should reflect that. The officer looked at Moss and then at Tara and rewrote the attribution to correctly identify her contribution. She had been in the room for this exchange. She had watched the officer look at both of them and then make the correction, and had thought about what it meant that the correction had required Moss to ask for it. Not with resentment. With the specific analytical attention she gave to everything. The record had been wrong. Moss had made it right. Both of those things were now part of the record, and the record was how the institution learned. It was a factual correction to a document that would be read by a limited number of people. But factual corrections to the record mattered. They mattered because the record was how the institution learned. If the record attributed the correct finding to the correct person using the correct methodology, the institution could replicate the finding. If the record was generic, the finding was lost. The section chief of the battalion's scout platoon, reading Tara's written methodology, attached a note to the report. Recommend development of formal doctrine for environmental baseline analysis in urban terrain. The note went to the battalion S3, who forwarded it to the brigade S3 with the same recommendation. She did not know this had happened for 3 weeks. When Moss told her, he said it simply, without decoration, the way he said most things. He said, "Your methodology write-up has been forwarded to brigade. There's a recommendation for doctrine development." She said, "I know." He said, "You don't know yet." She said, "I know it needs to be in the doctrine." He looked at her for a moment. He said, "Yeah, it does." She sat with this information for a long time. Not with satisfaction exactly, with the specific quiet of someone who has done what needed doing with what they had. The methodology her grandfather had given her, the specific system of knowledge that the Ojibwe people had developed over thousands of years of reading specific environments. That system, translated into military doctrine language, properly attributed, was going to be available to the next soldier who needed it and did not have a grandfather who hunted. She thought about what the methodology actually was. At its core, beneath the 4 elements and the analytical framework and the clinical language she would write it up in. It was this: pay attention to what the environment tells you, not just to what you expect it to tell you. Build the baseline before you need the anomaly. Read the sign first and draw the conclusion after, never the other way around. These were not military principles. They were not even her grandfather's principles in a proprietary sense. They were the principles of people who had been reading environments for thousands of years and had distilled from that reading a system that worked. She was the person who had brought them here, to this specific city, in this specific war, in this specific moment, when they had been the only tool available and they had been sufficient. She would describe it in the clinical language of military doctrine because that was the language that allowed it to travel through the institution. But she would know where it came from. She wrote this in her notebook, on the last page of the 4th volume, the night after the after-action report was finalized. Not for any audience. She wrote it because her grandfather had taught her to keep a record, and the record was where the knowledge lived after the person who held it was gone. He had understood this in the last week of his life when she sat beside him in the hospital in Baraga, and he was conscious, and they had the time for things that needed saying. He had asked her to describe what she had been learning. Not in the army. He knew she was in the army. He asked what she had been learning. She told him about the notebooks. She told him about the dust and the birds and the shadow geometry of buildings. She told him about the way she had taken what he had given her in the forest and found it present, unchanged in principle, in the streets of cities she had never imagined when they sat together in the birch stand. He had listened the way he always listened, completely, without rushing to respond. When she finished, he said, "I knew it would go with you to places I couldn't see." He paused. "That's why I gave it to you." She had said yes. He had looked at her directly and said, not dramatically, just observationally, in the way he said most things, "You have what I gave you. It will take you to places I never went. Read the sign wherever you are." She had said yes. She had meant it then. She meant it now. The next morning, as the sun broke over the dusty streets of Mosul and threw new shadows across the old city, shadows she had been mapping for 4 days, shadows that had told her what she needed to know, she opened a 5th notebook. She started at the beginning,